Now, your job is to act as normal as possible. How does a normal person act? Be like that. When you collect your belongings on the other side, go to track 3 and press play. Okay? Hit pause now. Welcome to the Parliament House foyer. You can...
Welcome, and the red light is on as well. No, we're not in the Parliament House foyer. What you were listening to there was Clown Analog's soundtrack to the 2017 David Finnegan play Kill Climate Deniers. Comes with a ripping soundtrack. You can download that from Bandcamp and put it in your iPod, go to Parliament House and do an alternative tour of Parliament House, reenacting scenes from the play as terrorists take control of Parliament House and demand climate action immediately of the government. Of course, it's fictional. It's a blended fiction. You also heard in one of the tracks there a Minister for the Environment. Do they actually exist? Well, we sort of had one for the last government. Now it's Susan Ley, but I'm not sure if many of us would be able to know the name of the former Minister for the Environment, or had ever heard her speaking in public or otherwise. However, environmental issues have brought down governments in Australia successively. You heard Malcolm Turnbull, who was actually a Minister for the Environment at one stage. And that was his demise initially. And so, yeah, these issues are significant. The point, I guess, is that we're talking about a crisis. And it's a climate crisis, it's an ecological crisis. And from a sociological point of view, it's crises and emergencies that are the periods in time when regimes justify their most extreme measures. I'll do a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to acknowledge... actually, we're not on arable coal land. My apologies. I should have checked that out in terms of where we are, in terms of acknowledgements. I'll acknowledge the traditional Aboriginal people of the land. And also to Clan Analog, who gave us the rights to use the music in lectures too, so independent artists. And to all of you as well for making it through the semester, and you've got essays due at the end of this week, so I'd expect there's a bit of work going on. If you've already done them and you're relaxing now, hopefully you'll enjoy the lecture. My name's Jai Cooper. I'll just flick over to the lecture slides. And today's lecture's on environment and society. I should have pointed out too, what you're watching there is the Bloomberg carbon clock, which is counting, like you have those population clocks at Times Square, and it counts how many billion people, we just ticked over 9 billion people on planet Earth or whatever. Well, this is the Bloomberg carbon clock. It counts parts per million of greenhouse gas equivalent. So it's not specifically carbon, but it's counting atmospheric greenhouse gas equivalents. And you can see there that, 621.5. It's going down.
Where's the sensor?
Where is the sensor?
Yeah, where's it reading it from?
I assume they're picking a whole series of data points. Yeah, I'll actually will go into some of the climate science a little bit. A trigger warning, we give trigger warnings about sensitive issues. Well, we might actually cover some science. I know that you started with sociology, hoping that you wouldn't have to deal with fluvial geomorphology or atmospheric science or riparian ecology. We will actually talk about a bit of those today. I just should mention too that with the book there, this was actually originally funded. The play was originally funded by the ACT government. A government grant helped to get this off and running initially. Andrew Bolt got outraged, and of course the play was pulled. Independent funding through the Griffin Theatre finally got it up. So we're having this struggle between state-based actors, large corporate actors, and grassroots actors as well in environmental politics and environmental issues broadly. Okay, so the overview of today's lecture is to look at what's the relationship between sociology and the environment. Like I said before, sometimes you think, oh, well, I'm not going to deal with scientific issues. And there's a bit of a schism between environmental science, or the sciences in general, or those sciences, and this science, these sciences, so behavioural sciences, human sciences and the natural sciences, and why those actually exist. We're going to look at what is the environment, how we define it, how we understand it. And so effectively these understandings are human constructs. We'll look at the new ecological paradigm, which is a way of thinking about the environment that has emerged and been identified probably since about the 70s. We'll look at the division between anthropocentric and ecocentric thought and the philosophical and ethical bases to environmentalism, and the two key divisions within environmental sociology. So the social constructivist and the realist approaches to environmental issues. This is in a reading that's provided from Terry Lay, wrote this, so it was a former chapter in that public sociology textbook. We'll look at some key thinkers in environmental sociology. So some who are just broadly discussing sociology and then cover environmental issues as well, or the relationship of the environment. So we're looking at macro-sociological issues. Climate change, a bit of science, but also the social effects. We'll look at the ecological footprint. So you might be thinking, when these kind of discussions come up, well, I do my bit. How can we calculate those? How can we calculate a community, the Central Coast, or a region? And then some of the actions that can be done. I'll begin with a cliche, as Tony Abbott's law states, for every good policy discussion there's a useless or annoying three-word slogan. And you probably have heard those kind of slogans like Greens cost jobs. 3 words, really quick, easy to remember. It pits the environment against the economy. Well, when we look at this from a sociological perspective, we can come up with another cliche to counter that one. You might have seen it on a bumper sticker somewhere. There's no jobs on a dead planet. There's no sociology, there's no university classes, there's no gender, there's no race, there's no ethnicity, there's no media. All of these games, these sociological games, are played in a material world, and all of them are to some effect, some degree affected by our relations to the environment. And if we ignore it, it will go away. Another cliche. I've been accused of the occasional dad joke as well, so my apologies. While we're on that, one of my favourite dads in popular fiction, you might remember Dale Kerrigan from The Castle. Yeah, well, can you smell that? That's the Serenity. This is one of my favourite places. You might have a place like this yourself, a place you go. Breathe it in, it's a bit of nature. We all go there and calm ourselves. I was up there on the weekend. This is Glenrock State Conservation Area, just between Newcastle and Belmont. And go up there, have a bit of a mountain bike. Yeah, nice trees, all the breeze and all those nice things. Yeah, might be on a calendar at home. Your family might have sent you one there. It was maybe sent to comfort you. And it's very Australian, isn't it? It's very, very nice. So it evokes a whole series of thoughts and emotions when we see an image like that. I'll come back to this. Human social interactions with the environment are more than just pictures on calendars. When we're engaged in sociology, our research, and I'll point that out, we are researchers, and our teaching has a strong focus on the interaction of humans within social systems such as the health system or the legal system, transport, societal structures, things that we create, nation states, constructed ideas such as gender, institutions such as universities, corporations, governments, and more. And when we work in sociology, we're talking often about inequality. And most of the time we're discussing inequality between humans. Bourdieu, as you may have covered, referred to sociology as a martial art, a way to overcome oppression. And once we have knowledge, we have an obligation to act. Noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobles. If you have an understanding of things, then that will require you to then use that understanding to help society. So sociology can challenge ideas, dangerous ideas. And some of the things that we covered earlier in this course were ideas such as biological determinism. A problem, because it leads to certain ways in which we will think and determine people to be. Increasingly, people are becoming more aware of the ways in which we relate to the environment, so our physical environment, and we think about how much time we're getting with nature and what kind of relationships we have with nature. These are things that are contested. We can use sociology to understand these interactions with our ecological environment, the non-human environment. And at the University of Newcastle, we have a pretty strong history of research where those sociologists who are teaching you have done a range of different work with regards to attitudes to the environment and understandings of the environment. So Terry Lay, I mentioned before, did research on a wide study of the Hunter region and understandings of people's relationship to the apocalypse. Give people 8 different apocalypses and which do they think is most likely to occur. And if we watch enough fiction, well, everybody, if you have a dinner table conversation, everyone's got an opinion. Vanessa Bowden has done research with corporate executives in the viticulture, the coal industry, in the Upper Hunter. Stephen Threadgold, youth attitudes to the future. Hedda Askland, you may have noticed the Upper Bulga campaign and the issues that have happened recently. Hedda was actually, as an anthropologist within our department, and she was actually researching with that community there. So the effects of researchers can influence policies because people become aware of what's going on in their communities. Pam Nyland has done research into youth in the environment in Indonesia, and I'll cover a bit of that in this lecture. And myself, I'm doing research into young people who have been in environmental workfare programs, such as the Green Army, Green Cause, over the last 30 years or so. Outside of academia, I did work in that sector, in natural resource management, community-based natural resource management, and before that as an outdoor educator. And it's pretty much inevitable in the field that you recognise that environmental management is as much about managing people as it is to managing species, other species. So you can't manage the environment without managing society. So back to this image. To borrow a quote from Sartre, hell is other people. We could refine that hell is knowledge. If ignorance is bliss, if to not know about a problem can lead you to a certain form of calm, then to understand problems is going to lead to a sense of anxiety. And I'm going to induce a sense of anxiety into you by discussing this topic. Right now, I want you to think about your bones. I want you to think about the PCBs, the radiation, the lead, the mercury, the residues in your bones. This is anxiety inducing. These environmental conditions, I want you to think about your future. Whether there is going to be a planet, what the climate is going to be like. We're dealing with things that affect the way that people feel. These are quite significant. And so when we discuss these issues, it's very easy to be involved in quite a discussion that can traumatise. And so I want you to look again at this image. What we might once look at and go, oh, nice calming image of some nice bushland. Well, I'm there thinking that I'm there to get my piece of nature, and it's a commodity that I need to consume to make myself calm, then I would be traumatised, because that last weekend the port-to-port mountain bike race was on, and there were just people just ripping through one after another, disturbing my peace and tranquility. You can also look, if you look really, really closely, look up on the horizon. Coal ships, cue the tritone. That's climate change right there. They're waiting to pick up coal from Newcastle and take it around the world to be burnt to affect the atmosphere, the blue sky that once looked so clear that we now start worrying about. Knowledge can also lead us to think about the Arabakal people and that area, and that was previously occupied, a whole knowledge of ethnobotanical knowledge of what plants to use, what animals, the seasons, and that dispossession has lost an enormous amount of knowledge. Some of it has survived. And in this foreground, pretty yellow flowers. Some of you are nodding. Yeah, familiar with Chrysanthemoides monolifera subspecies rotundata bitu bush from?
Not Australia.
No, not Australia. That's not Australia. All of a sudden, this beautiful piece of bushland, and this is coming through in my research, we corrupt people. 2 or 3 weeks into every Green Army program, all of these young people who have experienced a piece of bushland that they used to think was wild and natural, all of a sudden became weed infested with bitter bush and morning glory and lantana. It was wild and pristine, built cubbies in there, played games, and all of a sudden you've got this plant that infests 60% of the New South Wales coastline, a monoculture, brought here to help address soil erosion, and now a major weed problem. I'll use another anecdote to describe our understanding of our relationship to wilderness, and there will be more text if you want to take more notes, but I'm using some anecdotes just to get started with. As an outdoor educator, I was working once with a group of an elite Sydney girls' school in the Southern Highlands, and we took a bushwalk up to a lookout in the Southern Highlands, and we looked across miles and miles of pure bush, like this, bushland as far as the eye could see. And there was a Japanese exchange student, year 7, and she tapped me on the leg and said, "Jai," and everyone's sort of going, "Ooh, isn't it beautiful," as you do. And she says, "It's very beautiful, but who looks after the garden?" She'd come from a Japanese megacity and didn't have a concept. And of course, all the Australian students and myself, of course, this is Australia. That's wilderness. We had a name for it. We had a term for it. We were able to explain, and we were able to demonstrate our cultural strength, our knowledge of this is Australia, and we have cities, but we also have wilderness. I thought about that later, and okay, yeah. We're positioned, when we think of things in these ways, in a dichotomy between human culture as opposed to nature and wilderness. We're positioned in opposition. Here we had at one end Japanese Oriental exoticism from a megacity, and at the other end we'd forgotten to think about, well, there we were on Tharawal land at the time, looking across an extensive area that has been managed on an ongoing basis for tens of thousands of years. So the idea of wilderness extends from concepts such as terra nullius, that the land is unoccupied. Of course, in the absence of humans, it would do fine all by itself. But that land has been managed by the Tharawal. This land is currently managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, with all manner of community stakeholders, so Burwood Beach Coast Care Group, the Glenrock Trail Alliance, a whole series of interest groups as well, and plenty of neighbours as well. So what is the environment? A sociological approach can help with defining what it is. We could ask, is it everything other than me? Or is it just the non-human world? Is it the built environment? Those things that's constructed by humans, the bricks and mortar. Is there a natural environment that exists without humans in our mind? Do we have some picture of when I mentioned that before, pure bushland, do we have a pure form, a platonic, perfect form? So in sociology, we can look at ideas such as the nature-nurture debate and question our assumptions. Yet we need to be cautious about our engagement with the natural sciences, as they are with us. And there's been a historic reluctance of major theorists in sociology to engage with environmental issues and to have progressively moved away. It was an initial move away from biological determinism, that biology determines the way in which you are, to environmental determinism, that your geography, your place affects the way in which you are, to a sociological determinism. We can end up in that place that ignores the environment and biology. So environmental sociology hopes to look at all of those effects across the spectrum. Yet there has been problems. Positivist scepticism and an animosity to human behavioural responses come from those natural sciences, that what we do are not real science. And there's also been abuses that we're concerned about. The historic abuse of the biological sciences to justify atrocities against people based on their race, their gender, or their ability, such as the sciences of phrenology, as you would have had in the Aboriginal lecture, and eugenics as well. And the caution about human exemptionalism, and that the idea that we as humans can be placed above nature. Yet if you read into the work of sociologists, you'll see that the environment has always formed a part of sociological thinking. To go back to Marx, when Marx was discussing production, he was talking about a relationship between workers and the natural resources that they converted into commodities. The timber that comes to make these products, the plastics, they come from the environment. They're natural resources. Marx also discussed humanity's species nature. What would we be like if we didn't have rules and laws to govern each other, structures and systems and acculturation? If we were just, if you think about dogs, some dogs, that one might bite me, that one's not a problem. What is the species nature, the general species nature of people? The way in which we are when we are free. Are we an aggressive species? And Marx also discussed the metabolic rift that occurs between workers and the land when industrialised farming under capitalism alienates them from the land and the soil. So because you're not working to care for the land anymore, because it doesn't matter as much to you, you start exploiting it. So Marx was an early advocate of organic farming. He saw the advent of industrialised farming and the consequences of that for the soil. You might even see he's got the beard, so he looks a little bit like Costa. So maybe there's something going on there. And anthropologists have also studied the relations between people and species or objects in the environment. So kindred animals. We may have totems or relations ourselves to particular species with whom we relate, to sacred mountains, sacred landscapes, and we may see entities that dwell in environmental conditions, such as storms or drought, or in the land or in country. So another image, what do we see? What do you see there? You can see the tyres? Yeah. I was reading an article. No? You see tyres? You see tyres? Yes? Dumped across a landscape? Yep.
What once was a waterway?
What once was a waterway? Yep. I was reading an article the other day. People were looking at an underpass in Chicago and they saw the face of the Virgin Mary and the watermarks. We see what we want to see. Yes, they are tyres. And that was my first reaction. Tyres dumped. This is just up near Bendermere, out the back of Tamworth. Yeah? And I'm driving and I go, okay, well, all right, I'm jumping on the phone.
Old mine shaft there,
Old mine shaft?
where the bushes are, close to bushes. You usually plant some sort of bush over the top of an old shaft.
Yeah. Yeah, so you think this could be an old shaft in the gully?
Yeah.
Possibly? Yeah? Yeah. Because Bendermere has a mining history, or...?
Oh, I just think you can see in the country, well, that's where I'm from originally.
Yeah.
And they would, for whatever reason, they would put like some sort of mulberry bush if they, been down to explore for, not so much mine, maybe water or anything like that.
Yeah. Yep. So using the mulberry bush to cover up the old mine shaft.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
to detect it.
And to signify it.
Yes.
Yeah. So if we know that that's that particular bush, then it's a signifier of the mine. Yeah. So our knowledge leads us to understand the landscape. Yeah. I'm not sure it was winter, so it looks like it's hard to tell what kind of bush it actually is. But yeah, my first reaction was tyres. Most of us would think, yep, scattered tyres, and I'm jumping on the phone to the EPA or to council thinking somebody's, got to deal with the local tyre place and, okay, yeah, back your truck up, get rid of it. Yeah, you don't have to pay the tip fees and no worries, just dump them. Oh, okay. Maybe there's more to this. It could be that that's actually been the case. I don't know. But it could also be that this is actually, it wouldn't be legal now, but it's an antiquated form of erosion control. You dump a whole lot of tyres into the gully, chain them together, fill them with soil, and they actually retain the soil, and then you can plant. So if one solution that you're looking to solve, which is not to have the toxins from the tyres scattered in a landscape, is one person's problem, might be another person's solution to a problem such as erosion. So one person's eco-terrorism can be another person's salvation. That's how we look at it. I don't know if you can see the Virgin Mary in there. So these next 5 slides look at 5 key questions that we ask in environmental sociology. The first of these is, how are environmental problems known, defined and acted upon? Well, firstly, as Tony Abbott was hoping, maybe if there's no science, there will be no problem. If we eliminate the Climate Commission, that might mean that climate change will just go away. I don't know if he was thinking that exactly, but certainly if you don't have scientific investigation, how can you know that problems exist? You were looking at the Bloomberg carbon clock. How would you know what the levels of atmospheric carbon are without advanced instrumentation? Science is socially produced. This is a really good example from history. It's an ongoing history as well. The ozone hole was known about, and the problem was only dealt with after it was known about and known to be a problem. Recently, just in the news this week, they've found CFCs are being produced somewhere in, they suspect, eastern China. So the Montreal Protocol that was agreed to in 1987 to ban CFCs, some of those are still slipping through, and there are other chemicals that have been developed that are potentially ozone depleting. Ozone depletion is not global warming and climate change. These are separate issues, but they're both atmospheric issues. It's a really good example, though, of how global action can be taken against a threat to all life on the planet. Without ozone, crops fail and we all starve. Yet the only way that we actually knew that this was a problem was because a satellite that had been sent up that was designed to last a year and was collecting a whole range of different atmospheric data. Well, that satellite ended up lasting 14 years and collected an enormous amount of data, and over that 14 years it found that ozone was being depleted. Yet even though that data was coming in, scientists were very reluctant, and it's built into the scientific process. The first thing that the NASA scientists did were they dismissed it. And you can see there's the quote from Barsha. So from NASA, they were saying, we thought it was a problem with the instruments. The figures were so low, we thought, it's the data log is blipping. So we'll just ignore those figures. And it was actually an international rivalry that brought this about. The British took this seriously. They published an article in Nature, and before you knew it, in 1985, we had a British-American scientific rivalry where both were standing up going, we discovered the hole in the ocean. No, you just ignored it. We wrote about it and realised that it was actually a problem. Oh no, we've been watching this. We were just waiting until properly. So you can look at the history of this, but it points out the example that scientists are actually conservative. And when we talk about, or you hear it in the news about radical scientists, it's inbuilt into the process not to take risks with data because it means potentially being made out to be a shonk. Importantly, scientists are ordered by society to do their work. So who we fund, who gets funded, means what science gets ordered. And similarly by their rivalries. The cultural capitals that they seek to accumulate affects the research that they choose to do. And in recent years, the trust in science has become increasingly under question. So the public has, quite rightfully, questioned scientists who have had interests such as with chemical companies or going back to tobacco companies or otherwise. And we've become sceptical of climate scientists as well. There are also things out there that we don't necessarily know, the unknown unknowns, the Frankenstein monsters that are yet to emerge. Are we monitoring those? Genetically modified organisms. Is artificial intelligence going to get loose and turn us all into cyborgs? What can come out of left field? Pandemics, things that we don't know. Are we monitoring them? How well are we monitoring them? How effective is the science? How would we know if we don't fund science? Scientists don't just wake up in the morning and go, oh, I think I'm going to study pandemics because I know that they're coming. We actually order these. So scientists need to order their thinking, and they're also ordered to think about certain topics. And some scientists, or you might question whether they're genuine scientists as well, are prepared to think to order. Similarly, all of you, all of us, are all citizen scientists. We've all got cameras, we've all got access to stream watch kits, we can all report things to the EPA. So we have a practice of omniopticism. If you remember Foucault's panopticon, the omniopticism is all of us looking at everybody, monitoring. And what makes one person an expert and another not? Is it the qualification, the clothing, the experience, the impartiality or otherwise? Okay, a second key question in environmental sociology. Why are some potentially important issues largely ignored? Well, some causes may be more attractive than others, and some species might attract more sympathy. We all know that the koala, it's what's called a charismatic megavertebrate. It's got charisma, it's got vertebrae, and it's mega, it's big, it's large. This species, can anybody name this one down the bottom here? It's a crawbob. Yeah. Well, it's a crayfish. It is. Yeah. It's more endangered than koalas. But we probably care more about the koalas than we do. We hear more about koalas than we do about the orbost spiny crayfish.
Don't eat the koala.
What's that?
Don't eat the koala.
Can't eat the koala, yeah, that's right. So the orbost spiny crayfish is quite a threatened species. Back in the 90s, there was a blockade of a forest in East Gippsland, and feral hippies are set up with the tripods, and they're all camped out, and they'd been there for quite a long time and eating lots of veggie curries and looking at these things in the creek. And of course, can you eat it? It's blue, but I reckon if you cooked it up, it'll go orange. It'll be all right. And an ecologist there was camped in a tent because they were doing ecological monitoring, looking for greater gliders and other species, potoroos as well. And one of these came up and started chewing on the orange peel outside his tent. He's going, "Oh, almost spiny crayfish," and protected area, because we had the scientist, an ecologist who understood the species, knew what it was able to identify it. All of a sudden, no need for a great blockade. But because certain things people were looking for, whether they're potoroos or greater gliders or koalas to protect forests, are going to be looked for. And it's often because we have a human empathy towards certain species. Eyes on the front of its head, it's furry, it's cuddly. We may have had a toy one when we were a kid. Now, is this a large issue, the difference between which species get preferences or not? Well, it might not be if you're a politician. And there was a politician who once said, "I don't know if the long-footed potoroo is worth $280 million. How much do we value certain species?" It's certainly a large issue if you're a crayfish. A third question is, what are the roles of institutions and economic networks in shaping our relations with the non-human environment? I drove down from Newcastle today, borrowed the stepson's car. I just realised, you're driving on this massive infrastructure. When I'm in Newey, I like to ride my bike everywhere. When someone says, in our society, you can't survive without a car, we have built ourselves a system, the regime of automobility. We are currently building a massive communications system. We have a health system. We have all these different systems. And in the regime of automobility, when someone says that about our society and how we're so dominated, in our society you can't survive without a car, they're talking about their own life. They're talking about their mortal being. Their life is under threat. So if you're saying, "I'm going to take this off you," you're talking about killing them, effectively. Yeah? So when they're going to take your utes away, and you're all going to have to drive e-utes, it's a mortal threat. The system and the things that are embedded with that system as well are our attachment to institutions, organisations, great Australian institutions such as Caltex, California, Texas, or Woolworths. So when we fill up with petrol, we're not just jumping in our cars and winding up our windows and ignoring the world. We're driven in cars, that might be made in Asia or anywhere in the world, used to be made in Australia. Oil that's sometimes extracted domestically, may have come from somewhere else, maybe from an OPEC nation or otherwise, came down through the Great Barrier Reef in an oil tanker. Our rubber tyres come from plantations, possibly in Malaysia. The metal might be mined in Australia, possibly processed in China. So there are these enormous trade relations between institutions. And this is just the system of automobility as opposed to other systems as well. And there's, if you go and get your rego done, you're paying enormous amounts of revenue to the state government. There are taxes by the Australian government, which it's reinvesting, and then there's toll roads. And so very seriously embedded processes. Of course, the emissions are sent into everyone's atmosphere. That doesn't cost anyone because it just goes out there. We get to drive on roads that are paid for by rates and taxes. And these systems, primarily around motoring, compete with other systems, railways, buses, bikes, horses, and we have a regime of motoring that's normalised in Australia. So what are the roles of these institutions and networks, and who is affected by the relations between them? What power do they wield? if you've got a job in one of these, how do you feel when that's threatened? Are you able to speak up about pollution if you're working on the oil rig? Do they think that you're, well, okay, yeah, I agree, but I'm just not going to agree because I don't want to be seen to be that freak in my workplace. It's a workplace and you need to get along in that place. So what happens? And then also what happens when supplies suddenly vanish or drop? There it is, E10, 108.7. I remember the fuel price spike 2007, and that preceded the GFC. Now, people were screaming, oh, this is terrible. You know, Mick from Port Macquarie, though, he's thinking, am I really going to take out the Johnson 250s this weekend? Oh, it's going to cost me another $50 in fuel. Of course, he's devastated, but the fish, they're like, beauty. Mick's not after us this weekend. So the environment in some ways can benefit from some of these systems collapsing or having difficulty. A fourth question is, how are different social groups affected by environmental problems and controversies? This is the front page from when the Williamtown controversy was at its peak. So the Williamtown residents, you might remember the ADF firefighting chemicals getting into the water table there. Do we care more about people like us? Do affluent people have more skills to lobby for their issues of concern? Is a life in India worth a life in Williamtown? Do we have amongst us, have we already seen environmental refugees? Are victims of floods or fires refugees of environmental problems? Are there Pacific Islanders who are thinking, I need to migrate somewhere because my island is going to go under? The Syrian conflict that you're watching on the news currently was exacerbated by a drought. Is this another effect of climate change? And how will that be measured within a problem such as a civil war? Do we have rural Australians amongst us whose towns are struggling because they can't irrigate and we've reached the limits of the water supply and the Murray-Darling irrigation scheme is competing with environmental flows? Who's got the power to lobby? And then a fifth and final question. What are the roles of social movements in promoting positive environmental change? Who does the lobbying? Who's actually at the front end of these campaigns? And then, how is change affected? We heard, in the first time I've heard it in an Australian election campaign, the quote, a just transition. A just transition for workers. We've heard the Green New Deal coming out of the United States, which is a rehashing of Roosevelt's New Deal from the 30s. A just transition to a sustainable economy. And in this process, who ends up doing the work? If you think about your household duties, who does the recycling already? Who does the environmental work? Is it split along gendered lines? Who bears the burden? Is it the working class? And are these processes going to be centralised and hierarchic, or will they be decentralised and anarchic? Will change come from the top, such as in a centralised planning system, like a Green New Deal, in which we build large-scale wind farms and institute solar power farms that's managed by greenocrats? Or will it come from a whole series of localised initiatives? This is Fremantle, Holbert Street, which is a community that people just started planting out their verges. And the next thing you know, they were guerrilla gardening out the back on the bike path, and then they set up a festival, and they have converted a lot of their homes. Of course, their real estate values have gone up enormously, the sense of community, and they shut down the street. So will these things be ground up or top down? So why use sociology? Well, it can help us understand how environmental problems are caused and distributed, and what this tells us about global inequality. This is a great example. This one's from Vietnam in terms of global equality. This is Hoi An, which is a World Heritage City, where they have taken the old city and then refurbished it, and so you've got a lot of tourists coming in. And of course, tourists like recycling. So we have a recycling bin for the tourists there. So ideas about who does what, local people just, recycling, we don't do that here. Sociology can also explain effects on the environment, on people and population. Those effects aren't just physical, such as health outcomes, but also the development of how we speak about things, our discourses, our practices, and our beliefs, what fears we have. These things are cultural. And sociology can help evaluate policies and proposals that are aimed to providing solutions to environmental problems. We need to have a lot of people assessing these ideas and changes because there are great risks in leaving any decisions to an elite. In terms of the environment, most of the terminology and the definitions are currently discussing these 4 areas: climate change or global warming, the degradation of nature and the loss of biodiversity, loss of resources and pollution. As a quote though from Giddens, he highlights that overall, however, the environment and sociological work shouldn't assume any of these specialised meanings. It pertains instead to the surroundings in which humans exist and their relatedness to these surroundings. So we can look at environmental issues and we can break them down separately, but the environment itself and our understanding of it needs to stay flexible. All of these, I should point out again, are about loss. And it can be very easy to spot the environmental sociologists at the conference because they're usually in polo neck jumpers and they've got really serious frowns. There's a bit of a joke about environmental sociology. There's a section in the textbook about sociology and the problems of miserableism. Well, if you think about, there's all this inequality in society and then, the planet's going as well. Well, it's like multiplying that. So if you want to confuse an environmental sociologist, tell them that there's no inequality on a dead planet. Which one do I go with? So it's important to understand that there's some form of moral judgment that comes into this about the loss or degradation of condition of the natural world. Changes in the natural world are something that has happened naturally throughout history, yet we're accelerating them greatly. So these changes have also been accompanied by a whole new body of thought, a new paradigm. This is a key concept within environmental sociology, the shift from HEP to NEP. So Catton and Riley Dunlap in 1978 identified this distinction between the human exemptionalist paradigm. You may hear about American exceptionalism. Americans are exceptional. This is the human exemptionalist paradigm, the idea that humans are exempt from the effects of nature, that we can build our way out of environmental conditions. We can build ourselves a society, flying cars, and lots of chrome and shopping centres, and we're exempt from the effects of the environment. And the emergence of a new ecological paradigm. We need to understand that we are ultimately affected by it. And so they identified this paradigm and then they started applying it through research. They developed a survey scale, so the new ecological paradigm, and it asks questions such as, do you strongly agree? So a Likert scale, strongly agree or strongly disagree with something like, sacrifices must be made if we are to retain the full capacity of the natural world. Do you strongly agree through to strongly disagree? So the NEP is a way of asking a series of questions about values. An attitudinal scale. We can look at the change from the HEP to the NEP by a couple of key images in history. And we've got on the left there the Earthrise image, and we've got Mick Fanning's shark punching image. Great moment in human history. On the left we can see what occurred when the space missions started taking images of the Earth back from outer space, and we realised that we were living on an island. Island people understand sustainability in different ways because they understand the limits of expansion. You can't go too far. And when we all looked back and we saw that we were living on a planet and this it took us that much work just to get to the moon. Geez, Mars is a long way away, and it's just a smouldering, or it doesn't even smoulder, it's just a ball of rock. Maybe we need to look at caring for this planet ourselves. So it gave us a bit of perspective. So that was a significant phase in human history. The Mick Fanning incident demonstrates how that has been applied. Go back a couple of generations, if a great Australian had been attacked by a shark, there would have been waves of calls for shark culling and a response such as that. Yet nowadays, something like that happens, and of course we all applaud Mick for punching a shark, but we also make the very strong point that it's the shark's environment. We understand that. That's part of things. We can't be above nature. There is no going out there and exterminating all the great white sharks. Oh, it's an endangered species. It's only doing what it's thinking it should do, eating surfers. So we've changed from this idea of the earth being there for our uses and something that is an instrument for our benefit to something in which we live amongst and we accept. The idea of man versus nature is still there, but the idea that we are separate from that which is wild, the dichotomy that goes back to Aristotle, which that humans are civilised and that nature is wild and must all be domesticated to make it better, to improve it, well, that has shifted and changed. So Pam Nyland applied the NEP for some research into Indonesian youth, and you might see similar kind of outcomes to what you would expect here in Australia as well. There was certainty about the need to live in harmony with nature, but uncertainty about whether humans have dominion over nature. Not quite sure whether we need to dominate. We certainly need to live in harmony with nature. There was some denial about the need for limits to growth, and also uncertainty about how much economic growth might need to be restrained. Now, you might have those kind of conversations around the dinner table. How much economic growth do we need? We need economic growth, but we're just not sure how much. In short, these respondents wanted to live in balance with the natural environment, did not want to destroy it, but they didn't want strong limits on economic growth because that means limits to our affluence. These are based in the HEP and the NEP positions are based in two key philosophical perspectives or ethical positions on nature. The first is the anthropocentric perspective. Anthropos means human, and so the anthropocentric perspective places humans at the centre of the world. It's a human-oriented view of the environment. An ecocentric perspective, ecos means home or habitat, and ecocentrism places nature at the centre of our ethical considerations to place all species. Other terms that you might hear are biocentrism, to place living organisms at the centre of concern, misanthropy, which is when people say, oh, humans are a plague on the planet, yeah, they're just bad. That's to be anti-human. And post-human, to not only place others at the centre, but also consider the possibility of humans ourselves changing and evolving. But the two key splits there are anthropocentrism and ecocentrism. And they're two ways of understanding an extension of ethics to nature. In an anthropocentric ethic, nature deserves moral consideration because how nature is treated affects humans. We might care about nature, but it's because it's about how that might affect humans. And in an ecocentric ethic, nature deserves moral consideration because nature itself has an intrinsic value. It has the same etymology, the anthropocentric to the Anthropocene, and you may have heard that term used. It's now being applied to geology, and the idea that if we went down to the bottom of the ocean at the moment and we saw the sediment layer, we would see a fine slither of plastics in there, and we would be able to mark this as the Anthropocene era because the humans are the most significant effect on the geological record. A couple of examples for this are the conservation of elephants. So we can understand that people can use them as tourist attractions. That's a straight human utility. However, if they roam into your garden and you've got an anthropocentric perspective and they start wrecking your crops, then, well, they're fair game. They become meat. We can also try and look at this from a concern, a compassionate perspective. That if somebody treated these elephants poorly, whipped them or used the ear things or the saddles that they put on them, that this would be unfair to the elephant. But often this comes out of a concern that we wouldn't want humans treated like this. So that perspective is an anthropocentric perspective. An ecocentric example values the species for its own right, for its own existence. So we saw the example there with the shark. Another ecocentric example was Val Plumwood, who's a deep ecologist and philosopher, and she was actually holidaying up in the Kakadu and got attacked by a crocodile. And in the process of being taken down by the crocodile, had the presence of mind to realise she's prey, it's predator. That is its ethical position. It has a whole series of ethics. It doesn't see this as unethical, it's just doing what it's doing. And it led her to question relative views on ethics. So we can see that all species can have different ethical positions. A crocodile has a different set of ethics to an elephant, to a human. The questions start to get a bit more complicated when we look to things such as smallpox, which is sitting in vials in a couple of laboratories in the world. Smallpox is a horrible disease. It preceded a lot of colonisation and invasion and killed a lot of indigenous people. And it's now been restrained to these laboratories. Are we keeping it for biological research so that we might stop future diseases? Are we keeping it for biological warfare purposes so we could release it upon enemies? If we're to take an ecocentric perspective, we need to question, does smallpox have a right to exist for its own right? Does it have its own intrinsic value? So we can see that these ethical positions can be relative and socially constructed, a social construction. So environmental sociologists have thus pointed out two key approaches, the realist and constructivist perspectives. And that's a natural interval to take a little bit of a break and a stretch, and back in about 6 minutes. And we'll have another track.
And slowly make your way down the other corridor past the House of Reps, back to the foyer. You'll have 6 minutes for this walk. Take your time.
Welcome to the show. You're now meant to be scared, meant to be so terrified of global warming that you'll say, please, Prime Minister, save us. Give us your carbon dioxide tax.
The natural home of the modern totalitarian, and of all those who feel entitled by their superior morality to act as savages. How does the ACT government justify spending taxpayers' money on a theatre work entitled Kill Climate Deniers? What sane government donates to a project urging others to kill fellow citizens, even as a joke? Are these people mad? The theatre company says it's not into actual killing, just exploring ways to get political change. You know, like killing. If I were thug enough to write a play with the title Kill Climate Scientists, would I get a grant? Would the ABC rush to present my defence?
Yes, they
You guys are out of your tree.
I'm disgusted beyond description. This could only emanate from a left-wing socialist entity like the ACT.
Stark raving, insane, mad.
Green Labour pollies who obviously think it's okay to kill people.
This theatre company is really asking for
as long as it's not done violently.
titling their work as an incitement to murder.
I'm sure many on the Green/left would agree with
Should
you.
any such violence eventuate, the prime instigators will at least be known in advance.
David Finnegan can express such an extremity of doubt, persisting with his murderous intent.
Finnegan wrote, as typical of his kind, the fascist went
Exquisite parody or gross psychosis.
and humiliate and threaten anyone who dares dissent from their totalitarian world.
So this bozo Finnegan believes, metaphorically at least, that it's okay to kill and deny his provided it's done in a non-violent, soft
He should be investigated by the authorities so he can report the absolute force of this menacing account.
So now the ACT government is donating to a group that wants me and others like me dead.
Canberra, plenty of bulk fear drug-addled politicians, drugged kids reading Kill Climate Deniers in the original town of Acton, sunk beneath the
I'd like to see them try that greedy, hateful carpenter, and I will send those that try back to the ACT government in a box.
sociopath claims he would feel badly if
Postal payment on dignity.
5 years turns out skeptical.
The sociopathic twit behind that website needs to be jailed.
The man is a loon who probably has it before, but he wants to attack civilization with armed violent terror, incitement to terror.
Inciting such homicidal violence isn't fair. They don't have the stomach or dangling bits that some Aussie needs to put a face on fight.
That thinking will not be accepted in Texas.
I guess that other ways recognises
In
okay.
our way, we could imprison climate alarmists because they are lying to the populace in order to push their evil agenda.
Running over with cars,
Trying to control everyone and everything on the earth
or knives, or bombs might be okay at cowards first.
so that they can dominate over all citizens.
Maybe they intend to war and
Over the authority of authoritarian government in the
large deniers by restriction of terrorists
seek to enact and then enforce their green laws that will make
and the very way to go there. He has called armed violence to and including killing people. This is not parody or anything.
I think if a war starts, a lot of eco-activists will be killed first. It's just my opinion.
Thank you. Those words were from Andrew Bolt and his various commentators online. So some of those quotes were the actual opinions and perspectives of real people. The lyrics by Andrew Bolt, Bolt commenters, Joanna Nova blog, Bishop Hill blog, What's Up With That blog, and all the emailers who emailed David Finnegan, the playwright. So two key theoretical views on human relationship to the environment. Hannigan splits these up into realist and constructivist perspectives. Environmental problems can be known and revealed to us by science. This is a realist perspective. The environmental problems are real. They're problems for both humans and for other species, and therefore become ethical questions over how to respond. So we avoid that constructivist ethical dilemmas, and we see that this is simply a problem. How do we go about it? The constructivist perspective highlights that our knowledge of environmental issues is itself socially produced, and to some extent all environmental problems are constructed by humans. So we'll look at the constructivist approach first and then go into the realist perspective, using some examples. The constructivist approach investigates why some environmental issues come to be seen as significant while others are seen as less important or ignored, and it's because they're socially constructed. Small mammal extinction isn't necessarily important in the minds of people, but if you are in the whaling tourism industry, or simply we're concerned more about whales, and it's often backed up by the fact that we may have other interests there as well. The implication is that the way the physical environmental issues are perceived in contemporary society is influenced by our social environment. The things that are going on in society changes how we perceive what's arising. So those issues might not be direct reflections of reality. We need to question what is really important. When we see things in the media or that they're driven by industry or otherwise, what actually really matters. And the premise is based on the idea that nature can't speak for itself. So therefore, to an extent, all environmental problems are constructed by people. Taking that quote from the Lorax, I speak for the trees have no tongues. We try to speak on behalf of other species. Yet environmental problems are socially constructed. A couple of examples. The Liberal Party, May 2019, just check their environment policy this week just to see where they're up to with it, because it does get changed, especially after an election. And they're referring to cleaner and greener communities and cleaner oceans and waterways. Now, working in natural resource management, as soon as you hear somebody talking about the environment and wanting to clean it, it's a red light. It's a red flag. It says, caution. Because some people like clean environments, and that's often code. So we can do a discourse analysis of the coding, and it often means that what they're actually thinking about is underscrubbing the bush to remove all of that messy stuff underneath, or maybe taking out a few of those Banksias so we can get a clean view of the clean lake or otherwise. So the idea of clean communities is good. Greener, good. But there are other words that can get used. Also, cleaner oceans and waterways. Last time I checked, though, the environment was made of dirt. So the idea of cleaning it up and leading to solutions can potentially be a dangerous endpoint. So the constructivist approach can be applied to something like soil erosion. This is a classic one, and I encounter this a lot with work. So here's a bit of fluvial geomorphology, river restoration work. On the right, you can see what's called hard rock revetment. It's an eroding bank. You put down geofabric, and then you lay heavy, dense rock over the top, stuff that doesn't float away in a storm very readily. And so if you get a decent flood, it tends to stay there. And this is in a recreational area, so you can mow all the way to the edge. If it's a cattle farm or something, you can grade stock all the way to the edge as well, and you can maximise the kikuyu growth. So there's a few other benefits in there as well. It looks pretty clean as well, and if you think in terms of clean, that looks clean and neat. While on the right-hand side, what we have here is a healthier system, but it's in collapse. This is an alluvial bank, kikuyu to the edge. The cows have been allowed to get in underneath and graze underneath the mangroves. Mangroves regenerate, well, obviously the seed drops, and any small ones that reshoot, the cattle are chewing them off. You can see the way they've chewed off the base of the mangroves as well. So this is a system that is actually healthier, but is in decline as well. So there's a few different approaches. On the right, if you're a fish, you need to think about this being a better environment for you, because when the tide does come in, you've got some pneumatophores to swim around and breed in amongst and hide. The rock revetment on the left is decent habitat for rats, but not a lot else. All of this is based in the belief that erosion is bad. We need to go back and understand a concept such as erosion. If you go have a look out at the Great Dividing Range, it was as big as the Canadian Rockies at one stage. Erosion is something that does happen naturally. However, we have accelerated that. So this example shows a similar process and how that affects people's perceptions. This is obviously a steep bank with some mangrove regeneration. I had a landholder who came to me asking to have this erosion dealt with, this erosion problem. And it wasn't this bank, this is another landholder, but this landholder was asking about, I want to stop the erosion, And what you do is, well look, there's some mangroves there. We don't want to really hard rock revet it. And the mangroves are a bit of habitat. We could save that. And we could allow this to slump a little bit and just naturally erode back to its natural gradient. And natural erosion, I've never heard anything so preposterous. So the very idea of a natural process had become denaturalised in her mind.
What did she run on property? Did she run
Cattle. Yeah. And that's the previous one's a dairy farm. Yeah. So these are a couple of approaches. These are a couple of restoration approaches. As opposed to hard rock revetment, which is what she wanted. She wanted hard rock revetment because she wanted the erosion stopped and it to be neat. And so two approaches. Say with the cattle under the quite low level bank, all you do is you string up a fence. And that keeps the stock out. Within a very short period of time, you get a lot of mangroves regenerating. This is all lantana. So we could look at that and say, oh, that's messy and it's a weed and it's an environmental problem. But if you're trying to stop an eroding bank, it's actually your friend in that example. This is another example as well, which looks similar to the bank that she had. All you do is you put up a fence 5-10 metres back. You lose a bit of grazing land. You lose a bit of grass. But what happens in behind this? This looks really messy. They've just dumped some rocks on the sediment. But the mangrove seeds accumulate in behind and you build a living system. And a living system looks messy. It's got stuff everywhere. There's rocks sticking out. There's trees that are going to be growing in behind. But it actually becomes more resilient because if there is a failure of the system, then it can grow back. The rocks that you saw in the hard rock revetment might last 50 years, 100 years, but eventually at some point they have to be upgraded.
So you're resting the land to self-rejuvenate?
Yeah, it actually gets to the point where it can recover by itself, yeah. The idea, and the Hunter River is a good example of a system that has been heavily rock revetted, and that has been to allow floodwaters to get out quickly. And so there's competing interests of flush it out as opposed to retain it in the landscape, slow it down, and help for a system that can actually self-recover. A living system can self-recover. But the big point there, I suppose, is the idea of soil erosion, where this demonising of erosion comes from. Sure, it can be a problem, but what exactly is it a problem for? It's not toxic. It just causes sediment in other places, or it loses soil. And if you lose soil, that's not good if you're trying to grow kikuyu or crops on. And we've got that embedded in us from droughts that occurred in the 1890s, the 1930s, the 1980s. Erosion is bad, erosion is bad. We're losing our topsoil. So we have that concept embedded deeply from history. So when we see it here, we go, oh, erosion, we've got to stop the erosion. So erosion still is a natural process. So of course, okay, yeah, it can cause some problems. The costs, however, are quite different. If you are a landholder who's upriver with 5 kilometres of land, of river frontage that's easy to protect with a fence, and that's going to cost $5,000, as opposed to a landholder who's got this very severe eroding bank, to rock revet it costs tens of thousands of dollars. Yet, if you're $1 million property owner on a beachfront in Threadgold or somewhere, you've got a very loud voice. And it looks terrible when your house is falling into the ocean. So the idea of what gets portrayed, what we understand, is not only constructed in terms of erosion being a bad problem in the first place, but also who has that lobbying power. So the constructivist approach recognises that what gets to be chosen as an environmental issue is a matter of power in society. If you're sitting on $1 million property, if you've got friends in council, if you've got this ability to make waves, literally, about your eroding coastline, then you're going to have more influence. So the constructivist analysis asks us, what's the history of the problem? How have we come to understand this thing as a problem? Who is making a claim of the crisis? What evidence are they presenting? And what other views exist? And what do they say about it? Who aren't we asking? You could probably see in there the sociological imagination, the 4 aspects: a historic analysis, a structural analysis, a cultural analysis, and a critical analysis. And if so, if we are still looking at it and we're saying this is still a crisis, then we can determine suitable actions. The realist approach argues that environmental problems can be understood objectively. They're real. They exist outside of human consciousness and awareness. So, if a tree falls in the forest, the data logger recorded it. It happened. We don't need to see it happening. Realists search for causal explanations, and they're prepared to explore and to debate the natural science of environmental issues. So the natural scientists identify the problems, and if sociology has a special role, it's to look at the social systems. You work out the systems and see what those problems are. So to understand that, we need to know the scientific facts first. The scientists will tell us, and then we will go about looking at the systems. So here's an approach to that. Mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, progressive, degenerative and fatal disease affecting the central nervous system of adult cattle. It can be transmitted to humans who eat the beef of infected cows. So this spread in the UK back in the early part of the century. The problem's real because it affects cows and humans. It is a very real problem. And it's not only a real problem for those 2 species, it's also a problem for other species as well. If you're a sheep or a fish or any other species, then it might affect human consumption. We might be eating a lot more fish. So the realist analysis asks, what kind of creatures are cows? What are their capacities? What's the biology of humans that makes them react to the disease? And then how does the food system operate, and what political and economic decisions are made that allow dead cows to be fed to each other? It was the feeding of dead cattle in amongst the feed stock, recycling them back into the system, that caused the bioaccumulation of toxins. And also we can ask, why do people in the UK eat so much beef? It's cultural. If you actually go to Westminster, you'll see beef eaters there. So the realist approach recognises the problems are real, and is then split into 2 camps, the reformist and the radical approaches. The reformist model is often also described as ecological modernisation. Now you will hear Adam Bandt, Richard Di Natale, Maureen Faruqi, the Greens politicians. They will speak about reforms and changes. They will very rarely talk about economic contraction. So they may not be straightforward ecological modernisers, but they are co-opted into that ideology because it is too much to speak up and say we need to contract the economy. So they're talking about the problem is, well, there's not enough technology. We need better technology. We'll have solar cells, we'll have electric vehicles, but we won't get rid of cars. We'll just have Tesla electric cars and we'll all charge them. Now, what that means is that things get offset. A really good example of that and the way in which liberal democracies work with a reformist approach is solar cells. Solar panels are really good. They work well in an Australian landscape because we have high levels of home ownership, we've got good roof space and we've got good sunlight. So you put solar panels on your roof, you get a good return for the investment if you're a homeowner, which is most likely the middle and the upper class. Eventually, with battery power, maybe you'll be able to get off the grid even. Have solar panels, some battery banks, prices of lithium batteries are coming down, you'll be able to relieve yourself from the grid. But we're then left with those, the pensioners, the unemployed, the renters, still needing to get power from the grid. And we'll be in a situation where the price of maintaining that grid will go up. And of course that leads to political pressures. That class is going to then become represented by those who have interests in the ongoing production of centralised power systems through coal production. It is almost fanciful that something like this could actually happen in the future. But if you were listening to, what's his name, the energy minister this morning, talking about how these companies should not be divesting. They shouldn't be preferring some technologies over others. We actually have a liberal government designed to encourage economic liberty, freedom, asking companies not to do what they want to do commercially because they want to benefit certain forms of energy production. So there's a restriction. They're looking at the big stick approach to energy divestment. This is not the stuff of science fiction. This is actually, it's almost reached absurdist approaches. So the radical perspective criticises this. It says it's inbuilt into the processes of industrialised capitalism and the way in which democracy interacts with capital. The radical approach aims for a revolution in current practices. Society needs to be radically reconstructed to attain these environmental goals, and this model is linked to an ecological Marxist approach. The idea is that capital structures put profit before environmental issues. And we can see how that's constructed to a democratic process even. So any measure to address the environment through the capitalist system is flawed and doomed to failure. Eventually, we offset the costs into the environment. Rather than, oh, well, we can have solar panels, but shall we get rid of the car? No, we don't subtract. So the ecological Marxist approach argues that economists need to learn to subtract. Ulrich Beck suggests that we shouldn't overdetermine environmental problems and take either these constructivist or realist positions and be set with them. We shouldn't swear allegiance to any particular view or theoretical perspective. He argues that he's both a realist and a constructivist and uses them both as meta-narratives for the purpose of understanding the complex and ambivalent nature of risk in the world risk society in which we live. So I'll move forward to those some key sociological thinkers, and we'll come back to Beck and the idea of a risk society. The first we'll look at is Manuel Castells, and he regards environmentalism as a social identity. So you might think of conservationists such as the classic Steve Irwins or Ranger Stacey's, eco-warriors like Paul Watson and the Sea Shepherd, or scientists who become activists like Tim Flannery. And even the celebrities, the Leonardo DiCaprios and Kate Blanchetts of the world. It's intricately linked with the development of the network society. So as we're developing more and more technology, environmentalism is building that identity concurrently. He's still a realist. He's still saying that these environmental problems are real. He's just pointing out that this is actually built around environmental identity. So the Occupy movement is associated with this as well. Anthony Giddens, clearly a reformist. He wrote The Politics of Climate Change in 2009 and was an advisor to the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. So you can see that Britain's come a long way in terms of their climate policy, and that period was quite significant. Giddens spelled out the Giddens paradox, so not renowned for his humility, he named it after himself. This is the idea that the problems lack immediate tangibility. We can't feel them directly, so there's a delayed effect. It's like the boiling frog syndrome. We don't know until it's too hot and we're overcome by the heat. And climate change is a great example of that, where we'll actually get past the threshold. The train is rushing towards the cliff. We haven't gone over the cliff yet, but there's too much inertia to actually stop it. One way in which we can see this is that no one's got climate change written on their death certificate, yet we could possibly attribute it already. We're all frogs and we don't necessarily compute the problem. The next is Inglehart, and Inglehart drew our attention to the post-materialism thesis. So proposing a generational shift in values, we can say that we've moved from observable in the 60s and the 70s with the emergence of the hippie movement. As older generations died out after the war, newer generations started moving in. They'd never experienced scarcity. So, you know, you've got them amongst you, the people who save string. Why are you doing that? We might come in handy someday. You know, that magpie in the family, yeah? And the shed is full of stuff, yeah? They're materialists. Whereas you may also have them in your family. They're post-materialists. Oh, we can do without. Yeah, nature will provide. There is always abundance. Yeah. And that's, Inglehart is arguing, is based on never experiencing that scarcity. So once we have basic needs fulfilled, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're able to think of higher order needs. He argues that we need to have some key things there. An increase in societal affluence, a more even distribution of wealth, and the development of strong forms of governance to regulate society and regulate actions affecting the environment. So this comes out of the World Values Survey. You can see the change over generations. This is in UK and Western Europe, five countries from Europe, EU countries in the 1970s, and people who were older in that 65 plus cohort were more likely to be materialist and to have materialist values, and the younger people were more likely to have post-materialist values. You can see the shift between 1970 and 2000. This was Wells's analysis, and in 1970 you can see 27% or so are post-materialist or mixed post-materialists, and then by the year 2000 so many more people were post-materialists. So back to Ulrich Beck and the idea of a risk society, a key theoretical perspective on the environment. So Beck wrote Risk Society after as Chernobyl happened. It got published pretty much. And then it was translated, originally written in German and translated into English in 1992. Beck's argument that environmental risks are the predominant product. So we've moved from Marxism, which is saying we're contesting the means of production, to it's the things that are caused by our production that become the key things over which we're contesting society. The environmental crises that we keep ignoring and postponing keep coming back to hurt everyone, no matter how rich or how poor, through the boomerang effect. Beck explains that poverty is hierarchic, but smog is democratic. We're all affected by it. Such environmental risks are more difficult to handle than conventional ones like chimney pollution. We can go and put a filter on a chimney But these new risks can't be easily assigned to one particular actor and source. In fact, they're inherent to the industrialised, energy and materially intensive lifestyle of most countries in the world. So we end up with a battle between discourses. So when I talked to you before about the lead or the plastics or those feelings in your bone, we don't necessarily attribute them to single industrial actors. We might say these are our own poor choices because we ate the wrong products or we lived in the wrong place. It's very difficult to identify who actually caused this, who do we blame. So coping with the risk of climate change, which also threatens our lifestyles and welfare of modern societies, leads to a form of organised irresponsibility. Who do we blame? Who do we point the finger at? And how do we regulate? The problems or the causes of the problems or those who manufacture it are gone. They're off in history. So governments become very reluctant because it might affect standards of living. So regulating coal is going to affect those who are trying to elevate themselves through the system, and freedom of choice is something that we don't want to restrict. So it becomes difficult to restrict things such as greenhouse gas emissions or other forms as well. In this new risk society, unknown and unintended consequences come to be a dominant force that drives behaviour, including environmental campaigns. And environmental issues are moving from the margins of political concern to the centre. So the argument is that there's no point trying to fight over the cake if the cake itself is poisoned. So those environmental issues become key central arguments within the political field. People begin to realise that there's the cliche. The cake itself is poisoned. I've jumped ahead of myself. Social concern is prominent in societies where wealth and social climbing are considered achievable. Hence, the identification of risk depends on the level of social concern in a society, which is in turn driven by scarcity or abundance. So how we worry about these things relates to whether we're part of a modernised society or not. Because we all go down together, things such as class become zombie categories. Beck argues, and he uses that term. Other ideas such as the gendered division of labour or class divisions that were set up to make industrial society work, to develop concepts of wealth accumulation, become less important. Beck also discusses an idea for a hope for an enlightenment phase, a cosmopolitan moment in which we all recognise, well, we're all in this together. And because of this, he gets accused of being an optimist. It says, it's a bit like the idea of, in Independence Day, and Will Smith leads the world together to fight the aliens. Well, we're all going to fight climate change together, and that's going to bring society together. Beck says that's a possibility. He's probably more in that Giddens camp of not saying it's a definite outcome, but that there will be some degree of cosmopolitanism. So he doesn't make a definitive call on the future. Gibson Graham, another two authors. It's actually two feminist authors, and they combine to challenge the cult of personality and the lone white male sociologist, and they call for us to take back the economy. They're calling on us to develop new visions, new imagined futures, and that our economies can be restructured both to develop economic diversity, to have a whole series of different economies, and also that these are based on ethical choices. So a post-humanist community economy brings the intertwined nature of economic life to the foreground in decision-making around consumption, so our consumption practices. Now we can see that other forms of economies already emerging, land care, ecological services being provided, lets schemes, gift economies where people are trading. So they're asking for a post-humanist perspective, lots of volunteering, and enables social and environmental implications of individual enterprise and social consumption to be explored and ethically negotiated. So in a post-humanist community economy, economic activity doesn't end at the farm fence or at the factory door. When we do economics, we should be considering the wider impacts of what we're doing. Their perspective refers to our reality in the Anthropocene. It can be seen as a crisis, or it can be something to be embraced. If you're Russian oil explorers under the Arctic and trying to work your way through there, then you might try and embrace it. Or if you're a geoengineer, you might try and embrace it for those reasons. But it's asking us to push beyond the binaries of human, non-human, subject-object, economy, ecology, and thinking and acting, and to reframe the world as a vast experiment, to take risks. Rather than being owners of stuff, we become learners of knowledge, and we move from having to being. We take risks and become more adventurous in our economic experiments. Climate change science you're probably quite familiar with. I brought up the carbon clock before. That Bloomberg clock has a whole series of data through it as well in terms of the way in which it works. You did see it was going down. That happens seasonally every northern autumn, fall. The deciduous forests lose their leaves and the carbon will start to go back up again. Right now it's the northern spring, so it's actually taking in carbon out of the atmosphere. So you can see the lungs of the planet at work. Vegetation works. It's really important for carbon. We have key concepts there, terminology, global warming. It's referring to the recent and ongoing rise in global average temperatures. So we have carbon emissions causing global warming. The climate change is the increased activity at the Earth's surface. Carbon works like a blanket, and if you have more of it, the blanket gets thicker, keeps the Earth's surface warmer. When things are warmer, they speed up. Activity speeds up. Atmospheric weather activity starts to speed up. And so a lot of the solar radiation that comes and hits the planet doesn't escape. Climate at the surface accelerates, and we get more and more disasters. So we get sea level rise as well as increased climate disasters. There is a natural effect. So when you hear people on the news talking about, oh, carbon's a good thing because if we didn't have carbon in the atmosphere, we'll all freeze to death. Well, of course, we need a certain percentage. We don't need too much. So simple diagrammatic. Sunlight and warmth comes in, and CO2 actually traps some degree of heat in at the surface. However, the concentration has risen significantly from around 280 parts per million as the natural range, and suddenly to over 400 parts per million. What is it that we're doing to produce those? Well, we're burning a lot of fossil fuels and large-scale agriculture and land clearing. The effects are generally agreed upon that with global warming and higher temperatures around the planet, that we're going to get rise in sea levels, firstly due to the melting of polar caps and glaciers and extreme weather events. So if you think when there's a cyclone in North Queensland and the banana prices go up, well, I went to get pea straw a few weeks ago, and because there's a drought, well, the price of straw, because it's all going out west, all of a sudden it goes from $3 a bag to $15 or something like that. That becomes the new norm. We may be in a period where food has been more affordable than any period in human history. These things start to become normal. And then we get the real problem is when we start getting feedback loops. This is where the big problem lies in that the changes aren't linear, they're exponential. We talked about a blanket. Well, imagine somebody in your bed who's a little bit flatulent. They're downright rotting. And that rotting leads to a series of collapses in the system. These are some of the collapses. The rotting of peat material that has been under ice, under tundra, starts to rot and release methane, thawing permafrost. So we're seeing that in Siberia. Less snow and ice coverage, less white actually reflects light, and more droughts and wildfires releases more carbon into the atmosphere. So as the temperate forests dry out, so that's a classic example for Australia. The one that's predicted to be the killer blow for the planet is as as the oceans acidify, and that can potentially release deep sediment layers, deep methane layers from deep down below. And that will, of course, lead to a series of consequences. Rising sea levels, we're already starting to reinforce our coastal areas, but those ports are potentially going to be destroyed. The productive capacity is reduced, and we'll see coastal retreat. We're seeing that already. Food insecurity, I mentioned the banana shortage before, and also migration to avoid starvation from food-deprived areas. So increased pressures on increasingly smaller areas. The movements of diseases, so the spreading of dengue fever or others through mosquito-borne viruses, and our ability to respond to disease as well with controls. Geopolitical instability, nations beginning to contest water supplies, or even examples such as geoengineering. We might have solutions like that, but they could be used in ways that result in rain deprivation in some areas. And of course, accelerated species extinction. The sixth mass extinction is already underway. Regardless of climate change, we're clearing enough forests to remove enormous numbers of species that those ones that are there to repopulate in the vacuum, we don't have the same biological reserves. So this mimics similar processes to the mine collapse. Two ways of measuring human impact on the environment, two ecological footprint models. The first is to look at the measures or the demand on and the supply of nature for a given location. So take a region like the Central Coast and ask what is the demand, what type overall as a population, what are we demanding in terms of plant-based food products, timber, livestock, space, and then what areas can we use to take up the landfill and so forth, and also what supplies have we got in terms of biocapacity. So what cropland, grazing supply, how can we supply those? We've got fishing grounds, etc. Notably, some regions don't have the ability to produce energy from, so oil at the moment is imported from outside of those. Schematically, we could look at that, that any area has a vegetation as a biocapacity. We've got cars, they're a carbon liability. Cities and suburbs are energy liabilities. Waterways are food capacities. They can be places for waste management as well. There's a couple of calculators there that you might use in your tutes, or you can do it at home. So we can look at it at a community level, and we could say that the Central Coast or the Hunter operates within our biological capacity. We're operating at a profit, yet most of the world operates at a loss and has to import a lot of their resources. The other approach is to look at it from an individual perspective, the ecological footprint too, and to ask how can we measure our own personal impact. So it could be measured either in global hectares or in planets. So for example, if you're living in a cabin in the bush, do you need 5 hectares worth of land to support the type of lifestyle that you're living? Not many people can do that. Not even Bear Grylls does it. He comes back to home for get his production, his videos edited. For most Australians, we're living at about 3 planets if everybody was to live like us. So we may be living in a place where we're living within the capacity of our area, the regional capacity is there, but individually are we living within that as well. So what can be done? Of course, cutting the use of fossil fuels in transport, domestic energy use in heating and cooling, and some of the big effects can be done not simply by changing our energy use, but by insulation, cutting production and consumption of those unnecessary goods, recycling and reuse of production, preserving existing forests, moving to renewable energy sources and using supplies efficiently. Importantly, talked a lot about the miserabilism that goes with this. Sorry, it's a great way to end your semester, isn't it? 2040's just been released. Go and watch the movies. Go and feel good about people trying to do things positively. Get involved in community gardening. Have fun. Go out. Remember, there's still a planet out there. There's still a lot of bush. Howl at the moon. Do whatever you want to. Live in creative ways, and take some time in nature as well. Are we at a crossroads in terms of where the world heads? Well, a few years ago we had the Pasha land on our shore. The idea of a Green New Deal has been mooted in the United States, so there are significant international calls for change. If you enjoyed this topic, here's a plug for SOCA1010, Environment and Society. It runs currently as a compressed course in winter, so it'll start on June the 24th. So if you're looking to get an extra unit in, get ahead, we cover these. It's really an expansion on what we've done, the theoretical debates, climate change, science and politics, energy futures, food and the environment. So we look at permacultural systems, different forms of design, housing, urban design, different consumption practices, social movements, eco-activism, developing countries and environmental impacts. Malaysia's sending plastics back. Return to sender. Did you hear that on the news this morning? And we look at those great historic collapses, the mine collapses and otherwise, Indigenous perspectives on land management in relations to country, the economic approaches, and also we even look at future visions and scenarios, so delving into sci-fi apocalypses, dystopias and utopias. In terms of summarising, we've conceptualised different ideas of nature and the environment. What is the relationship of sociology, the NEP? We've looked at the constructivist and realist perspectives, and then the two divisions within realism, the radical and reformist. We've looked at Beck and the Risk Society, looked at a number of different researchers, and global warming, climate change, and the ecological footprint. So on behalf of Julia, myself, the other lecturers and tutors, thank you for the semester. Thank you for your participation. Good luck with getting your essays in and the rest of your course. Cheers, guys. Oh, one more track from...
Walk out the big glass door onto the Queen's Terrace. Take a look down Anzac Parade and up at the flag.
I'll put on the essay.
What's it? Yeah. On the survey. Yeah, no, it was good. It was good. I'm from around there in your town.
Yeah.
Well, so tin is gold around there.
The one thing we know for sure is that there is no climate change.
Because
There never was.
there was a very, very...
It was the very people that I misguidedly put at risk through my poorly chosen play title that fought through the tide of misinformation and deceit and boldly stood up for what we now know to be true.
Yeah, so it was either I just kind of rallied off that.
To those few climate deniers, those men and women who stood up against the tide of popular opinion, who ignored 97% of scientists and every respectable peer-reviewed journal, who took a stand against the poor countries already claiming to feel the impact of increased severe weather events and sea level rise. Thank you. You are the true heroes. Thank you for blowing against the wind.
That concludes the Kill Climate Deniers walking tour. We recommend heading through the doors into the Queen's Terrace Cafe and grabbing a cup of tea. Thank you so much for taking part, and remember, everything you've seen on this trip today was paid for with taxpayer money. The flags, the artwork, the security cameras, the assault rifles, they belong to every Australian. It's all yours. It's all yours. Have a beautiful day.